The weight of the world seemed to press down on David as he stared blankly at the ceiling of his darkened room. His once promising career was now a monotonous grind, filled with deadlines and pressure that left him drained at the end of each day. The laughter and warmth that once filled his home had been replaced by a cold silence between him and his partner, Olivia. Their conversations had dwindled to curt exchanges, and every attempt to reignite the spark seemed futile. David knew something had to change, but he had no idea where to start. Life had become a series of events beyond his control. Rising expectations at work, personal loss, and the crushing weight of anxiety. The overwhelming sense of helplessness gnawed at him, and every effort to push through only seemed to worsen his sense of failure. David felt trapped, his mind a chaotic mess of worries about the future, regret over the past, and fear that this was all life had to offer. One evening, after another frustrating day at work, David found himself scrolling aimlessly through his phone, searching for something, anything, that might offer him a glimmer of hope. That's when he stumbled upon a quote from Marcus Aurelius. "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength." The words struck a chord deep within him. He had heard of Stoicism before, but it always seemed too distant, too ancient to be relevant to his modern-day struggles. Yet in that moment, something shifted. David started researching Stoic philosophy, discovering how this ancient practice had helped people throughout history face adversity with resilience and inner peace. He read about the Stoic idea of controlling one's thoughts, letting go of what was uncontrollable, and finding calm amidst chaos. For the first time in months, David felt a spark of hope. Maybe there was a way to stop the relentless flood of stress and negativity. Maybe, by adopting Stoic principles, he could finally regain control, not over his circumstances, but over his mind. Driven by desperation more than certainty, David made a decision. He would dedicate the next week to fully immersing himself in Stoicism. He was determined to practice its tools and principles, hoping they could help him overcome the mental and emotional turmoil that had been suffocating him for too long. The stakes were high. This was not just about self-improvement. It was about survival. David needed to reclaim his peace of mind, and this was his last shot. The first day of David's journey into Stoicism began with an unsettling sense of anticipation. He had chosen 5 principles to focus on throughout the week, beginning with the one that seemed most foundational, the dichotomy of control. The concept was simple in theory: focus on what you can control and let go of everything else. But as David sat down to make a list of the things within his control, his mind rebelled against the very notion. How could he not try to control the outcome of his projects at work? How could he let go of worrying about Olivia's coldness toward him? It felt counterintuitive. Nonetheless, David started small. He made a mental note to focus only on his actions at work, his attitude, his effort, and how he communicated with his team. He promised himself he wouldn't obsess over how his boss reacted or whether his colleagues respected him. But by mid-morning, the old habits kicked in. A snide comment from a coworker sent him spiraling into anger and frustration, and he found himself dwelling on it for hours. How could he be expected to ignore these slights? They affected his career, his reputation. By the end of the day, David felt defeated. The idea of letting go of control was proving harder than expected. He came home feeling even more agitated than before. Olivia barely acknowledged him when he walked in, and as much as he tried to stay calm, the tension between them weighed on him like a heavy fog. That night, as he lay in bed, he couldn't stop replaying the events of the day in his mind, berating himself for not being able to follow through with the principle. This was supposed to help, but so far, it felt like he was failing at even that. The second Stoic tool David attempted to practice was negative visualization, the idea of imagining worst-case scenarios to help one appreciate their current reality. It sounded grim, but the philosophy behind it made sense. By mentally preparing for potential hardships, one could reduce the shock when things went wrong and learn to value what they had in the present. David decided to try this exercise on his way to work the next morning. As he sat in traffic, he visualized losing his job. He imagined the crushing weight of financial insecurity, the humiliation of having to explain it to his family, the despair of feeling worthless. His chest tightened and his heart raced as he let the scenario play out in his mind. Panic began to rise, and for a moment, David wondered if this exercise was doing more harm than good. But as he pulled into the parking lot, something unexpected happened. The anxiety began to fade, replaced by a quiet, almost eerie sense of relief. He still had his job. The worst had not come to pass, and even if it did, he realized life would go on. There would be other jobs, other opportunities. By the time David reached his desk, he felt a strange, newfound gratitude. The stress of impending deadlines hadn't disappeared, but it no longer felt insurmountable. He wasn't as emotionally tied to the outcome because, in his mind, he had already faced the worst. Negative visualization hadn't eliminated his fears, but it had softened their impact, allowing him to approach his day with a bit more calm. However, negative visualization wasn't without its own emotional toll. By the end of the day, the mental exercise of imagining loss left David feeling drained. He couldn't shake the lingering sadness of having lost everything in his mind. Although it had given him perspective, it also amplified his sense of fragility, that everything he had could be taken away in an instant. He wondered if he was strong enough to continue down this path, or if the Stoic tools were just too emotionally taxing for someone in his fragile state. The third principle David tackled that week was amor fati, the love of fate. This was perhaps the most challenging of all, as it required not just acceptance of life's events, but embracing them, good or bad, as part of a greater plan. After his attempts with the first two tools, David was hesitant. How could he possibly love the moments of disappointment or failure? His resolve was tested almost immediately. A major deadline loomed at work, and despite his best efforts, things went wrong. The team missed key milestones, and David knew the fallout would be severe. The old David would have spiraled into self-blame, anger, and frustration. But now, standing in the aftermath of the failed project, David tried to adopt the Stoic mindset. This failure was not something to rage against, but something to embrace as part of his journey. He reminded himself that amor fati meant accepting everything as it is and finding value in every situation. It wasn't easy. The frustration bubbled beneath the surface, and David found it almost impossible to view the failure as anything other than a setback. He was still tempted to fight against it, to question why things had to go wrong. But each time these thoughts crept in, he reminded himself of the principle. Slowly, the frustration gave way to a quieter acceptance. Yes, things had gone wrong, but that didn't mean they were without purpose. Maybe there was a lesson here that he hadn't yet seen. By the end of the third day, David felt emotionally exhausted, but something was beginning to shift. Though he struggled with the Stoic principles, there were small moments, fleeting but real, where he sensed a change in his perspective. It wasn't that his problems had vanished, but the weight of them seemed to lift, if only slightly. For the first time in weeks, he went to bed without replaying the day's failures in his mind. He was far from mastering these tools, but a seed had been planted. And in those brief moments of clarity, David realized that this journey wasn't about perfection or eliminating adversity. It was about learning to navigate life's inevitable struggles with a sense of inner peace, a sense that no matter what happened, he could endure. By the fourth day of David's journey into Stoicism, something remarkable had started to happen. The initial resistance that had plagued him was giving way to a sense of understanding. The Stoic tools he had been practicing, although challenging, began to subtly reshape his thinking. And now, as he approached the next Stoic tool, the view from above, David felt a strange sense of anticipation rather than dread. The view from above required him to mentally distance himself from his immediate problems by imagining his life from a bird's-eye perspective, or even further, from the view of the stars. From that vantage point, everything in life would appear small and insignificant. It was a humbling practice designed to remind him that his individual problems, which felt so monumental up close, were tiny specks in the grander scheme of existence. At first, this exercise felt abstract and difficult to connect with. How could picturing himself as a tiny dot in the universe help him with real-world issues? But David gave it a shot. On his lunch break, he found a quiet spot in a nearby park, closed his eyes, and tried to imagine floating up into the sky. He imagined his body rising above the park, then the city, and eventually above the earth itself. He visualized his life as a small part of the planet's vast ecosystem. From this perspective, his concerns, the missed deadlines, the tension with Olivia, his anxiety about the future, felt almost laughably small. As David opened his eyes and gazed out at the world around him, a sense of calm washed over him. The problems hadn't disappeared, but for the first time in weeks, they didn't feel overwhelming. Instead of being consumed by them, David felt a sense of detachment. Not in a negative way, but in a way that allowed him to see things more clearly. His troubles were just part of the ebb and flow of life, not the entire story. Later that day, when a minor issue at work threatened to throw off another project, David noticed a shift in his reaction. Normally, this kind of setback would have triggered a spiral of frustration and panic. But now, with the view from above fresh in his mind, David found himself less emotionally attached to the outcome. He handled the problem calmly, fixing what he could, and accepting what was beyond his control. For the first time in a long while, he left work without feeling the weight of unresolved issues bearing down on him. In the days that followed, David continued to practice the view from above regularly, each time gaining more clarity and peace. It allowed him to step outside his immediate emotional responses and see the bigger picture. This practice, more than any other so far, brought a profound sense of perspective to his life. Problems still existed, but they no longer felt like life or death matters. They were just moments, fleeting and manageable. The final Stoic tool David introduced into his routine was perhaps the most transformative. Memento mori, the practice of remembering that one day we will die. At first, the concept seemed morbid, even unsettling. Who wants to dwell on their own mortality? But as David delved deeper into the philosophy, he realized that memento mori wasn't about fear. It was about appreciation. By acknowledging the finite nature of life, one could learn to value each moment and stop wasting time on things that didn't matter. David decided to embrace this principle fully. Each morning, as he prepared for the day, he would remind himself that this day could be his last. Initially, this thought sent a shiver down his spine, but soon it began to fill him with a sense of purpose. Small annoyances, like the traffic on the way to work or a snarky comment from a coworker, no longer seemed worth his energy. If this was his last day on Earth, why waste it on trivial frustrations? One evening, after a particularly exhausting day, David sat on the couch beside Olivia. They had barely spoken to each other in weeks, the strain in their relationship now a constant presence in their home. But that night, something felt different. David looked at her and thought about memento mori, about how life was short and unpredictable. Did he really want to spend it in silence and resentment? For the first time in what felt like months, David reached out and took Olivia's hand. She looked at him, surprised, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. The tension that had built up over time seemed to dissolve, even if just a little. They didn't have a long, profound conversation that night, but the gesture was enough to break the wall that had been growing between them. Over the next few days, David found himself more attuned to what truly mattered. He stopped agonizing over the things he couldn't control, let go of the desire for perfection at work, and most importantly, began to cherish the moments he had with the people he loved. Memento mori wasn't about living in fear of death. It was about living fully, appreciating each day as a gift. The cumulative effect of these Stoic practices was undeniable. By the end of the week, David felt like a different person. He hadn't solved all his problems. Work was still stressful at times, and his relationship with Olivia was still a work in progress. But his mindset had shifted. He no longer felt like a victim of circumstance. Instead, he felt equipped to handle whatever came his way, armed with the tools of stoicism and a newfound resilience. As David sat at his desk on the final day of his week-long Stoic experiment, he reflected on how much had changed in such a short period. The adversities he faced hadn't disappeared, but his ability to cope with them had transformed. What once felt like an insurmountable weight on his shoulders now seemed like manageable challenges, thanks to the 5 tools of stoicism he had learned to practice. The dichotomy of control taught him to stop wasting energy on things he couldn't influence. At work, he focused solely on his actions and attitude, not on the outcome or how others reacted. This had lifted a massive burden off his shoulders, allowing him to work with clarity and calm rather than stress and anxiety. Negative visualization had been a tough pill to swallow at first, but it had shown David the value of his current life. Imagining worst-case scenarios made him appreciate what he still had, his job, his home, his relationships, rather than taking them for granted or living in constant fear of losing them. It had shifted his mindset from scarcity to gratitude. Amor fati had been perhaps the most challenging principle to adopt, but it was also the most freeing. By learning to accept and even embrace life's setbacks as part of a greater plan, David stopped fighting against reality. He no longer viewed failure or disappointment as enemies to be avoided, but as necessary components of growth. The view from above gave him the ability to see his problems in a broader context, reducing their emotional impact. By distancing himself from the minutiae of daily life and viewing his existence as part of a vast, interconnected whole, David found a deep sense of calm. His problems, once so consuming, now felt small and manageable in the grand scheme of things. Finally, memento mori had given David a profound appreciation for life's fleeting nature. Remembering that his time was limited helped him focus on what truly mattered: his relationships, his passions, and the experiences that brought him joy. It had allowed him to let go of petty worries and live with a greater sense of purpose. As David reflected on the week, he realized that Stoicism wasn't about eliminating hardship. It was about changing how you respond to it. Adversity was inevitable, but suffering was optional. The tools he had learned didn't make life easier, but they made him stronger. They gave him the mental resilience to face whatever challenges lay ahead with grace and courage. David's journey wasn't over. He knew there would be setbacks in the future, moments when he'd fall back into old habits of worry and frustration. But now, he had a foundation. A set of principles he could rely on to bring him back to center when life inevitably tried to throw him off balance. As the story draws to a close, David addresses the reader directly, offering a simple but powerful message. We all face adversity. It's a part of life. But how you respond to that adversity is entirely up to you. You have the power to choose how you react, to control your mind, even when the world around you feels uncontrollable. The tools of Stoicism are not just ancient wisdom, they're practical, actionable steps you can take today to live with greater peace and purpose. David encourages the reader to take the same journey he did, even if just for a week. Try practicing the dichotomy of control, use negative visualization to appreciate your life, embrace amor fati, take the view from above, and remind yourself of memento mori. He challenges the reader to see how these principles can change their mindset, just as they changed his. In the final moments of the story, David leaves the reader with a final thought. Life will never be without challenges, but with the right tools, you can face those challenges with strength, clarity, and peace. The Stoics believed that true happiness comes from within, from mastering your mind. And now I believe it too. With that, David closes his journey, not as a man who has conquered adversity, but as someone who has learned to navigate it with grace, ready for whatever life may bring.